When the Israelites reached the borders of Canaan, God instructed Moses to choose 12 leaders, one from each tribe, to explore the land he had promised them. These were not ordinary men, but respected representatives sent to witness the future homeland of Israel. For 40 days, the spies moved through the hills, valleys, and fortified cities of Canaan. They marveled at the richness of the land, gathering huge clusters of grapes along with figs and pomegranates as evidence of its fruitfulness. But they also saw something that filled many of them with fear: giants, tall descendants of Anak, living in mighty cities with walls reaching to the sky. The spies felt small in comparison, and their courage quickly melted. When they returned to Moses and the people, they presented the fruit and admitted that the land was overflowing with abundance. Yet 10 of the spies delivered a fearful report, insisting the people of Canaan were too powerful to defeat. Their words spread panic throughout the camp, and the Israelites wept through the night, wishing they had never left Egypt. They complained bitterly against Moses and even suggested choosing a new leader to take them back to slavery. But Joshua and Caleb tore their garments and urged the people not to lose heart. They reminded Israel that God was with them and would surely help them conquer the land if they only trusted him. The crowd refused to listen and were ready to stone Joshua and Caleb. But the glory of God appeared at the tent of meeting, stopping their rebellion instantly. God declared judgment, saying the entire generation that rejected his promise would wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Only Joshua and Caleb, who believed, would one day enter the land they had seen. When the Israelites camped on the plains of Moab after defeating neighboring nations, fear spread through the land like wildfire. King Balak of Moab trembled at the size and strength of Israel. Determined to stop them, Balak sent messengers to a distant diviner named Balaam, offering riches if he would come and curse Israel. Balaam listened, but told them he could only speak what God allowed. That night, God warned Balaam not to curse Israel, for they were blessed. Balaam sent the messengers back, refusing the king's offer. Balak, stubborn and desperate, sent higher-ranking officials with even greater wealth to tempt Balaam. Though tempted, Balaam repeated that he could only obey the command of God. At last, God permitted Balaam to go, but only under the condition that he speak only what God put in his mouth. Balaam saddled his donkey and began his journey to Moab. On the road, the angel of the Lord stood against him, invisible to Balaam, but seen clearly by the donkey. 3 times the donkey swerved, crushed Balaam's foot, or fell beneath him to avoid the angel's sword. Angry and frustrated, Balaam beat the donkey, not realizing the danger before him. Then God opened the donkey's mouth, and it spoke, questioning Balaam's cruelty. Suddenly, Balaam's eyes were opened, and he saw the angel standing in the road with a drawn sword. Terrified, he bowed low as the angel confronted him for reckless disobedience. Trembling, Balaam confessed his wrongdoing and offered to return home. But the angel instructed him to continue, under one strict command: he must speak only what God tells him. When Balaam finally reached Balak, the king rushed to meet him, frustrated that Balaam had delayed. Balaam answered boldly that he could not speak his own words, only God's. Balak led him to a high place overlooking the Israelite camp and demanded a curse. But as Balaam opened his mouth, blessings flowed instead, declaring Israel strong, numerous, and protected by God. Confused and angry, Balak tried again from another location. Yet once more, Balaam blessed Israel, speaking of their future victory and God's unchanging favor. Balak, furious now, dragged Balaam to a third place, hoping the view might change the outcome. But Balaam, filled with the Spirit of God, proclaimed even greater blessings, foretelling Israel's rise and the downfall of their enemies. Balak exploded in rage, telling Balaam to flee without payment. Balaam responded calmly, reminding him that no amount of gold could make him defy the command of God. Balaam returned home, having blessed Israel 3 times instead of cursing them. And Balak, defeated without a single sword raised, realized that no enemy could overturn what God had already blessed. Korah, a Levite with growing pride in his heart, gathered Dathan, Abiram, and 250 respected leaders of Israel to challenge Moses and Aaron. They claimed Moses had taken too much authority, insisting that all the people were holy and equal before God. Moses fell face down, grieved by their rebellion and warning them that God himself would show who was truly chosen. He commanded Korah and his followers to bring censers with incense before the Lord the next morning. The next day, the 250 men arrived arrogantly with their bronze censers, standing beside Korah with confidence that God would support them. Meanwhile, the rest of Israel gathered to watch, unsure of what would happen. God told Moses and Aaron to separate themselves from the assembly so he could destroy the entire people. Moses pleaded passionately for mercy, asking God not to punish everyone for the sins of a few. Moses then warned the people to move away from the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. The rebels stood proudly at the entrances of their tents, men with hardened faces, joined by their wives and children who watched fearfully. Moses declared that if the rebels died natural deaths, then the Lord had not sent him. But if the earth opened beneath them and swallowed them alive, then Israel would know they had despised God, not Moses. As soon as he finished speaking, the ground split apart with a thunderous roar. The earth opened wide, swallowing Korah, Dathan, Abiram, their families, and all their possessions. Terror spread through Israel as the people fled, shouting that the earth might swallow them too. Fire then came from the Lord and consumed the 250 men who offered incense in rebellion. Their bronze censers were later hammered into a covering for the altar as a permanent reminder. And Israel learned that questioning God's order was far more dangerous than they understood. As the Israelites journeyed through the wilderness, they camped at a barren place called Meribah, where the sun beat harshly on the dusty ground. The people were exhausted, thirsty, and frustrated, and soon they began to argue with Moses again. They complained loudly, demanding to know why Moses had brought them out of Egypt only to die of thirst in the wilderness. Their voices rose in anger, and tension spread through the camp like wildfire. Moses and Aaron, overwhelmed by the people's constant grumbling, went to the entrance of the tabernacle and fell face down before the presence of the Lord. The glory of God appeared, and the Lord spoke clearly to Moses. God instructed Moses to take his staff, gather the assembly, and speak to the rock so that water would flow out for the people to drink. It was a simple command meant to display God's power and mercy. But when Moses returned to the crowd, frustration clouded his judgment. He raised his voice, calling the Israelites rebels, and struck the rock twice with his staff instead of speaking to it. Water gushed out in abundance, pouring like a river across the dry ground, and the people and their livestock rushed to drink. Though God still provided water, he told Moses and Aaron that because they did not trust him enough to honor his holiness, they would not enter the promised land. The place was called Meribah, meaning quarreling, because the people complained and tested the Lord's patience, yet he still showed them mercy. Miriam, the prophetess, and Aaron, the high priest, spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman he had married. But beneath their words was something deeper, a challenge to Moses' unique authority. They said, "Has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Hasn't he also spoken through us?" And their hearts became lifted with pride. The Lord heard their words, and suddenly he called Moses, Aaron, and Miriam to come out to the tent of meeting. A pillar of cloud descended and stood at the entrance as God addressed them. He made it clear that while he spoke to prophets through visions and dreams, Moses was different. Moses was faithful in all God's house, and with him God spoke face to face, plainly and without riddles. When the Lord finished speaking, his anger burned against Miriam and Aaron, and the cloud lifted. In that moment, Miriam's skin turned white like snow. She was struck with leprosy, unclean and separated. Aaron turned toward her in horror and immediately realized the weight of their sin. Aaron pleaded with Moses, confessing their wrongdoing and begging that Miriam not be left like a stillborn child. Moses, known for his humility, did not argue or defend himself. Instead, he cried out to the Lord with a simple and desperate prayer, "O God, please heal her." The Lord answered Moses, saying that if Miriam's father had spat in her face, she would have been disgraced for 7 days. So Miriam was shut outside the camp for 7 days, as the law required for anyone who is unclean. The entire camp of Israel did not move forward until she was brought back. After 7 days, Miriam was healed and restored to the community. Only then did the Israelites continue their journey through the wilderness. The incident became a lasting warning to Israel that God defends those he appoints, and pride and rebellion carry serious consequences. This story unfolds at a pivotal moment in Israel's history, following the rescue from slavery, a long rebellion, and on the very edge of promise. The Israelites had been enslaved in Egypt for generations before God Almighty delivered them through Moses with signs and wonders. He parted the sea before them, defeated their oppressors, and led them into the wilderness with a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. But the wilderness was not only a journey toward freedom, it was also a place of reckoning. When the people doubted God's power, his promises, and rebelled, God declared that the disobedient generation would not see the promised land. They would wander until they died in the desert, and their children would inherit the promised land instead. Even Moses and Aaron, Israel's chosen leaders, were told they would not enter the land because they failed to honor God fully when Moses struck the rock at Meribah instead of obeying his command to speak to it. The long wandering in the desert, then, became both a classroom and a judgment, forming a new generation while bringing the old to an end. During these years, God gave Israel laws to shape their identity as a people set apart for him. He warned them repeatedly not to adopt the practices of the nations they would encounter or the customs of Canaan, the land they were about to inherit. Those nations worshipped many gods, oppressed the vulnerable, and built societies on injustice. Israel's laws, including how land was owned and passed down, were meant to reflect God's justice, not merely a cultural habit. Inheritance was not just about property, it was about identity, survival, and remembrance. As Israel stood on the brink of entering the Promised Land, the land was about to be divided among the 12 tribes. This was no longer a theoretical law, it was practical, immediate, and permanent. What would be decided concerning the inheritance would shape generations to come. It was at this critical moment that the story of Zelophehad unfolds. Zelophehad was a man from the tribe of Manasseh, a descendant of Joseph. He had not rebelled against God. Neither was he part of Korah's uprising. He simply died during the wilderness years, before the inheritance land was allocated. But there was a problem that threatened to erase his name entirely. Zelophehad had no sons. Only daughters. 5 of them. Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. According to the custom at the time, their father's land would pass to other male relatives, and his lineage would quietly disappear from Israel's records. The daughters would be left without inheritance, without land, and without their father's name attached to the future. They refused to accept that outcome. In an unprecedented act of courage, the 5 sisters stepped forward together. They approached Moses, Eleazar the priest, the tribal leaders, and the entire assembly at the entrance of the tent of meeting. In a society where women rarely addressed national leadership, their presence alone was bold. But their words were even bolder. They asked a question that exposed the silence in the law. Why should our father's name be removed from his clan simply because he had no son? This was not rebellion. It was reason. It was not emotional defiance. It was justice, carefully spoken. Moses did not dismiss them. He did not defend tradition for tradition's sake. He did not claim authority where none had been revealed. Instead, he did something deeply significant. He brought their case before the God of Israel. God's response was decisive and unmistakable. God said, "What Zelophehad's daughters are saying is right." With that declaration, inheritance law changed. For the first time, daughters were formally recognized as rightful heirs when there were no sons. A man's legacy would no longer disappear simply because it passed through women. The law expanded, not because society demanded it, but because justice required it. Later, concerns arose about tribal boundaries. What if inherited land passed through marriage to another tribe? Once again, the law adapted. Women could inherit, but were encouraged to marry within their tribe to preserve communal balance. The solution did not silence women. It refined the system. This story reaches far beyond ancient Israel. Even today, inheritance remains deeply unequal in many parts of the world. Some cultures allow only men to inherit land. Others permit women by law but resist them in practice. Often, these customs are defended as tradition or religion, yet the Bible itself records a moment when women questioned inheritance, and God affirmed them. The daughters of Zelophehad did not demand power. They demanded remembrance. They trusted God enough to ask. And the God of Israel, the God of justice, answered in fairness. Standing at the edge of the promised land, 5 women reshaped the future, not through rebellion, but through courage, clarity, and faith. Their inheritance was land, but their legacy was justice. Why would the very man chosen to receive God's law be the one to destroy it? Why would Moses shatter commandments written by the finger of God himself? Was it uncontrolled anger, or was it a prophetic act exposing something deeply broken? To understand why Moses broke the stone tablets, we must look beyond the moment of impact and examine what was already cracking beneath the surface. Israel had lived for generations as slaves in Egypt, confined but preserved. God delivered them with undeniable power, plagues that humbled Pharaoh, a sea split in 2, and enemies drowned behind them. When they crossed the Red Sea, Israel did not simply escape Egypt. They entered a new phase of their identity. No longer slaves, They were now a people being shaped into a nation under God. At Mount Sinai, this transformation was meant to become permanent. God called Moses up the mountain to receive the law that would define Israel's relationship with him and distinguish them from the nations they would encounter. The 10 Commandments were not merely moral rules, they were covenant terms, shaping how a free people would live under divine authority. But freedom revealed something slavery had concealed. One uncomfortable question often goes unasked. How did former slaves have enough gold to make a calf? Before leaving Egypt, God instructed the Israelites to ask the Egyptians for silver, gold, and fine clothing. Their former oppressors, shaken by the plagues, handed over their wealth. What was once payment for centuries of forced labor became Israel's provision for the journey. That gold was never meant for idol-making. It was meant for the tabernacle for worship, for beauty dedicated to God. Instead, the people melted it down to shape a God they could control. Provision became perversion. Moses remained on Mount Sinai for 40 days and nights. To the people below, God felt distant again. The cloud remained, but Moses, the visible leader, was gone. Fear crept in. Impatience grew. Faith weakened. They turned to Aaron and said, "Make us gods who will go before us." Not later. We won't wait for Moses. Maybe he died on the mountain. Make us a god to lead us now. This raises a troubling question. Why did they suddenly need a visible God? During their years in Goshen, the Bible does not describe Israel worshiping idols. They cried out to the God of their fathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So what changed after the Red Sea? Crossing the sea removed Egypt from around them, but not from within them. In Egypt, they had no power, no freedom, no responsibility. But in the wilderness, though they were free, faith was required. Waiting was required. Trust without sight was required. And that exposed their discomfort with an invisible God who moved on his own timeline. The golden calf was not just a statue, it was a statement. It revealed impatience. They would not wait. It revealed distrust. They doubted God's presence. It revealed character. They preferred familiarity over faith. It revealed rebellion. They violated commandments God was still writing. The calf reflected Egyptian religious imagery, strength, fertility, visible power. It was not a rejection of God's existence, but a reshaping of God into something manageable. A God who could be carried. A God who would not speak. A God who would not command. And while the people celebrated, God told Moses exactly what was happening below while he was still on Mount Sinai. When Moses descended the mountain, he was carrying more than stone. He carried covenant. And then he saw it. The dancing, the feast, the golden calf glinting in the sun. Moses threw the tablets down and shattered them. This was not a loss of control. It was a declaration. The covenant had already been broken before it was delivered. The shattered tablets reflected the shattered relationship. Law without obedience was meaningless. Stone intact would have lied about the state of the people's hearts. What did this reveal about Moses, God, and Israel as a young nation? Moses showed righteous anger, but also deep responsibility. He confronted sin without excusing it, yet immediately stepped into intercession, pleading for mercy. He was willing to be erased if it meant Israel would live. God revealed both justice and mercy. He judged the sin, yet renewed the covenant. He invited intercession and responded to it. Instead of abandoning Israel, he commanded new tablets to be carved, proof that failure did not end the relationship. Israel revealed who they truly were at that moment, freed from chains, but uncomfortable with freedom, rescued, but not yet transformed. Why did Moses break the 10 Commandments? Because the people had already broken them. Because covenant without faith collapses. Because sometimes truth must be shattered before it can be restored. And the question still lingers? Why do we demand visible gods when silence tests our faith? And what parts of Egypt do we still carry after crossing our own Red Seas?
When Israel finally crossed into the Promised Land, every tribe received an inheritance: Judah, Ephraim, Manasseh, Benjamin, Issachar, Zebulun, Asher, Naphtali, Dan, Reuben, Gad. All 11 tribes were allotted land, all except one. The tribe of Levi stood in the middle of a historic land distribution and received no territory of their own. No borders, no farmland, no ancestral estate to pass down. Why would God intentionally exclude one tribe from the very promise that defined Israel's hope? The book of Joshua carefully records the division of Canaan. The detail is striking, almost repetitive: measurements, boundaries, landmarks, until a quiet but powerful statement appears: "But to the tribe of Levi he gave no inheritance, since the Lord, the God of Israel, is their inheritance." This was not an oversight. It was not punishment. It was by design. The Levites were excluded because their role was different. Although the Levites received no territory, they were not left without dwelling places. God commanded that every tribe give up cities for the Levites, as it is stated in the book of Numbers. Command the Israelites to give the Levites towns to live in from the inheritance the Israelites possess. In total, the Levites were given 48 cities, scattered throughout all Israel. Why scatter them? Because the Levites were not meant to rule from one region. They were meant to serve, teach, and remind the entire nation of God's law. Their presence among every tribe ensured that worship, instruction, and accountability were never far away. Among the 48 Levitical cities were 6 cities of refuge. Their purpose was radical for the ancient world. If someone killed another person unintentionally, they could flee to one of these cities and be protected from revenge until a fair trial took place. These 6 towns shall be your cities of refuge. Numbers 35-13. The Levites were entrusted with guarding justice, restraint, and mercy, not land ownership, but human life. This reveals something profound. While other tribes guarded borders, the Levites guarded conscience. Because the Levites had no farmland, God established another system. I give to the Levites all the tithes in Israel as their inheritance. Numbers 18:21. Israel was commanded to give 1/10 of their produce, livestock, and income. Tithing was not charity. It was not optional. It was a recognition that everything belonged to God. The Levites depended entirely on the faithfulness of the people. When Israel honored God, the Levites thrived. Israel's rebellion meant the Levites would suffer first. Later, when Israel drifted into rebellion, neglect, or idolatry, the Levites were the first to suffer. Their tables emptied before the landowners felt loss. Their children felt hunger before kings felt judgment. This reality explains why God later confronts Israel so sharply through the prophet Malachi in Malachi 3:18. Will a man rob God? Yet you have robbed me. But you ask, how have we robbed you? In tithes and offerings. This was not merely about money. It was about withholding honor, trust, and obedience. By neglecting the tithe, the people were not just disobeying a law. They were abandoning the Levites, the very ones tasked with preserving worship, teaching the law, and guarding spiritual life in Israel. To rob the Levites was, in God's eyes, to rob God himself. The statement reveals something uncomfortable. Spiritual neglect has human casualties. When devotion grows cold, it is often those closest to sacred service who feel the cost first. Even the Levites were commanded to tithe from what they received, proving that no one stood above obedience. This arrangement traces back to one defining moment. When Israel built the golden calf, God called for loyalty. Whoever is for the Lord, come to me. Exodus 32-26. Only the Levites responded. Their obedience cost them blood, family ties, and comfort, but earned them God's trust. What began as Jacob's curse, "I'll scatter them in Israel," later became their sacred assignment. The Levites lived without land security, agricultural wealth, political dominance, yet they carried God's presence, God's law, God's mercy. Their inheritance was invisible, but mighty. The Levites remind us that not every blessing looks like ownership. Some callings are sustained by faith, not property. Some inheritances cannot be measured in acres. While the 11 tribes inherited land, the Levites inherited responsibility, and that raises an uncomfortable question for every generation. If God asked you to live without visible security, but promised His presence instead, would that be enough?
Why would a God who had just freed a people from slavery immediately introduce a system that required them to give away a portion of what little they had? Was tithing about money, or was it about something much deeper? To understand tithing, we must first understand who Israel was at the time it was introduced. Israel had just emerged from Egypt, not as landowners or merchants, but as former slaves. They had no national economy, no farmland yet, no inheritance, and no experience governing themselves. For generations, everything they produced belonged to Pharaoh. Freedom was new. Responsibility was new. Even trusting an invisible God instead of a visible master, was new. It is into this fragile, forming nation that God introduced tithing. What is tithing really? Tithing, in its simplest biblical form, means giving 1/10 of one's increase. But in Israel, it was never merely a financial transaction. It was a system, a structure designed to sustain worship, justice, and community life. Biblically, tithing was primarily agricultural, grain, livestock, oil, not coins. It supported the Levites, who owned no land and served at the tabernacle, the poor, including widows, orphans, and foreigners, the festivals, communal worship, and remembrance of God's deliverance. So the question commonly asked is, why did God want their money? But what we often forget to ask is, how do you build a nation that remembers who its provider is? Tithing appears even before the law of Moses. Abraham gave 1/10 to Melchizedek. Jacob vowed 1/10 to God, but it becomes institutionalized after the Exodus. In Numbers and Deuteronomy, God formalizes tithing as Israel prepares to enter the Promised Land. This timing matters. Israel was about to shift from wandering dependence, manna, to settled abundance, farms, vineyards, herds. Tithing was introduced before prosperity, not after. Why? Because abundance has a way of making people forget. One uncomfortable truth is this: tithing exposed the heart of the people. God did not need Israel's resources, but Israel needed to learn that their land, rain, harvest, and peace were not self-made. Tithing trained them to see prosperity as stewardship, not ownership. It also created accountability. The Levites depended entirely on the people's obedience. When Israel honored God, the Levites thrived. When Israel withheld, the Levites suffered. This is why God later says through the prophet Malachi, "Will a man rob God? Yet you have robbed me." The issue was never greed. It was broken covenant responsibility. Tithing forced Israel to ask a hard question. Do we trust God enough to let go? Even in ancient Israel, tithing was not always practiced faithfully. Prophets repeatedly confronted the people, not for giving too little money, but for giving while living unjustly. This tension continues today. Some argue tithing was only for Israel, tied to the temple and the Levites. Others insist it is a timeless command. Some churches weaponize it. Others avoid the topic entirely. So what's the truth? Biblically, tithing was part of a theocratic system, a nation governed by God, with no standing army paid by taxes, no welfare system, and no private priesthood income. It was not voluntary charity, it was national obedience. But the principle beneath it, honoring God first, sustaining spiritual leadership, and caring for the vulnerable, did not disappear. What did tithing mean for Israel? At its best, tithing created balance. Worship was maintained. The poor were remembered. Spiritual leadership remained accountable. Prosperity did not erase dependence on God. At its worst, when ignored, society fractured. Worship declined. Justice collapsed. Faith became hollow ritual. Tithing revealed Israel's spiritual health long before crises appeared. And what could this mean for Christians today? Here is the controversial question. If Christians are not under the Mosaic law, why does money still reveal faith so clearly? The New Testament does not command tithing in the same legal way, but it intensifies the principle, calling believers to generosity, responsibility, and integrity. Jesus speaks more about money than almost any other topic, not because God needs it, but because our hearts cling to it. Tithing, whether practiced as a tenth or not, forces the same ancient question upon modern believers. Who is your source? In the end, tithing was never about building God's wealth. It was about shaping a people who understood that freedom, provision, and purpose all come from Him, and that what we hold in our hands was never meant to stop with us. When the Bible speaks of Canaan, it does not describe a vague spiritual land, but a very real, physical region with borders, cities, peoples, and conflicts. Canaan was the land promised to Abraham, inherited by Isaac, passed to Jacob, and later pursued by the Israelites after centuries of slavery in Egypt. But where exactly was Canaan, and how does it map onto the modern world today? Canaan was located in the ancient Near East, along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea. In modern terms, it largely overlaps with Israel, Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza, Lebanon, southwestern Syria, and parts of Jordan. This narrow strip of land sat at the crossroads of Africa, Asia, and Europe, making it one of the most strategic and contested regions in the ancient world. Trade routes, armies, and empires constantly passed through it, which explains why it was rarely peaceful. Biblically, the boundaries of Canaan are described multiple times, especially in Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, and Joshua. The land stretched from the Mediterranean Sea in the west to the Jordan River and beyond in the east, from Lebanon in the north, down toward the Negev Desert in the south. God described it as a land flowing with milk and honey, not because it was magical, but because it was agriculturally rich compared to the surrounding deserts. To the north, Canaan bordered what is today southern Lebanon and parts of Syria, including areas near ancient Sidon and Tyre. These were Phoenician cities known for trade, purple dye, and seafaring. To the south, the land faded into the Negev wilderness, an arid region that marked the edge of settled life. To the east, the Jordan River formed a natural boundary, separating Canaan proper from territories later occupied by tribes like Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh. To the west, the Mediterranean Sea served as both a boundary and a gateway to the wider world. Canaan was not a single nation. It was a collection of city-states and ethnic groups, including the Canaanites, Amorites, Hittites, Jebusites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Girgashites. Each controlled fortified cities such as Jericho, Hebron, Hazor, and Jerusalem, then called Jebus. This explains why the Israelite conquest was gradual and fragmented. It was not one war, but many. When Israel finally entered the land under Joshua, the territory was divided among 12 tribes, each receiving a defined inheritance, except the Levites, who were given cities instead. These tribal allotments roughly correspond to modern regions: Judah in the south, around Jerusalem and Hebron, Ephraim and Manasseh in central areas, Galilee in the north, and coastal plains near today's Tel Aviv and Gaza. Why does this still matter? Because Canaan sits at the heart of modern geopolitical tension. The same land promised in Genesis is the land disputed today. Understanding where Canaan was helps explain why this region has never stopped being contested. The Bible presents Canaan not just as territory, but as a test of obedience, identity, justice, and coexistence. So when we ask, where was Canaan? The honest answer is unsettling. It was where ancient promise meets modern conflict. The land still exists. The borders still echo. And the questions raised in Canaan thousands of years ago about land, faith, power, and belonging are still being asked today. When God gave Israel the 10 Commandments, they were not yet a settled people. They had no land, no king, no standing legal system, and no shared national culture. They were newly freed slaves, fresh out of Egypt, still learning what freedom even meant. For over 400 years, their lives had been controlled by Pharaoh's laws, punishments, and gods. Now, at Mount Sinai, something historic happened. God formed Israel not just as a people, but as a moral nation. The 10 Commandments were given early in Israel's journey, shortly after the Exodus and before they entered the Promised Land. This timing matters. God did not wait until they were prosperous or organized. He gave the law while they were still dependent on Him for food, water, and direction. The commandments were not a reaction to chaos. They were a foundation meant to prevent it. This is why the commandments were necessary. Israel needed more than freedom from slavery. They needed freedom from chaos. Slaves do not create laws, they obey them. Free people must learn self-governance. The 10 Commandments provided moral boundaries that would shape Israel's identity, relationships, and worship. They revealed what kind of God Israel served and what kind of society they were meant to build. Unlike surrounding nations whose laws were enforced by kings, Israel's laws came directly from God. This established a radical idea for the ancient world. No human ruler was above moral law. These are the 10 Commandments handed down to the Israelites through Moses. 1. You shall have no other gods before me. This command established loyalty. Israel was called to worship one God in a world overflowing with idols. 2. You shall not make idols. God rejected physical representations because He could not be controlled, reduced, or manipulated. 3. You shall not take the name of the Lord in vain. God's name represented His character. This command guarded reverence and integrity. 4. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Rest became a moral command. In a world of endless labor, God insisted on dignity and trust. 5. Honor your father and mother. Stability in society begins in the family. This command protected generational order and respect. 6. You shall not murder. Human life was declared sacred because humans bear God's image. 7. You shall not commit adultery. This preserved trust, family structure, and social stability. 8. You shall not steal. Property and labor were to be respected, discouraging exploitation. 9. You shall not bear false witness. Truth was essential for justice. Lies corrode communities. 10. You shall not covet. This final command addressed the heart, teaching that wrongdoing often begins with desire. Together, these laws governed worship, relationships, justice, and personal character. Though given to Israel, the Ten Commandments have continued to shape the global sense of morality. Principles against murder, theft, perjury, and adultery appear in legal systems worldwide. Many modern constitutions and legal frameworks reflect these values, even in secular societies, because they address universal human behavior. For Christians today, the commandments are not a means of earning salvation, but a moral compass. Jesus summarized them into love for God and love for neighbor, showing that the law's purpose was always relational, not merely legal. The Ten Commandments remind believers that faith is not only spiritual, it is practical. They shape how people treat God, others, and themselves. In a world still wrestling with justice, truth, rest, loyalty, and integrity, these ancient words spoken to a young nation remain remarkably current. Before Israel ever failed, God warned them what failure would cost. Deuteronomy chapter 27 takes place at a critical moment. Israel is still in the wilderness, standing on the threshold of the promised land. Moses knows he will not cross with them. Time is short. So instead of soft encouragement, he delivers something far heavier. A public declaration of obedience and curse. This chapter is not about private belief. It is about national accountability. Moses commands Israel that the moment they cross the Jordan, they must do two things. First, they are to set up large stones, plaster them with lime, and write the law of God clearly upon them. This was not symbolic art. It was permanent testimony. The law was to be visible, readable, and unavoidable in the land. Second, an altar was to be built. Not with iron tools, but with uncut stones. Because God's covenant could not be shaped by human pride or craftsmanship. Moses then divides the nation. 6 tribes, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Joseph, and Benjamin, were commanded to stand on Mount Gerizim to bless the people. And these 6 tribes, Reuben, Gad, Asher, Zebulun, Dan, and Naphtali, were commanded to stand on Mount Ebal to pronounce the curses. This was deliberate. The people were positioned between blessing and curse, forced to hear both. This chapter focuses on the curses pronounced upon Israel in the event of the following sins. Then the Levites spoke loudly, clearly, publicly. They listed the curses. Each curse targets a sin that destroys society from the inside. Cursed is anyone who makes an idol, a thing detestable to the Lord, the work of skilled hands, and sets it up in secret. Cursed is anyone who dishonors their father or mother. Cursed is anyone who moves their neighbor's boundary stone. Cursed is anyone who misleads the blind. Cursed is anyone who withholds justice from the foreigner, the fatherless, or the widow. Cursed is anyone who sleeps with his father's wife, for he dishonors his father's bed. Cursed is anyone who has sexual relations with any animal. Cursed is anyone who sleeps with his sister, the daughter of his father, or the daughter of his mother. Cursed is anyone who sleeps with his mother-in-law. Cursed is anyone who secretly kills the neighbor. Cursed is anyone who accepts a bribe to kill an innocent person. Cursed is anyone who does not uphold the words of this law by carrying them out. After every curse, the entire nation responds with one word: Amen. They were not silent observers. They were participants. By saying Amen, Israel agreed that these curses were just. Deuteronomy chapter 27 reveals something crucial. God's concern was not ritual failure, but moral decay. These curses targeted sins people commit quietly, sins that courts might never see, but God always sees. Idolatry done in secret. Injustice done under authority. Sexual sin hidden behind family walls. Violence disguised as opportunity. Israel was being warned that the land would not tolerate corruption, even if the people did. This laid the moral foundation for Israel's future. It explained why later generations would lose the land, why enemies would succeed, why exile would come. Israel was not expelled because God was unfaithful. They were expelled because they publicly agreed to the terms and broke them anyway. This chapter makes Israel's judgment legally justified. They heard the curses. They said Amen. They crossed the land knowing the cost. Deuteronomy chapter 27 confronts modern faith sharply. In today's world, belief is often private. Morality is negotiable. Sin is excused as personal choice. But this chapter teaches that God does not separate worship from justice. You cannot praise God publicly and exploit people privately. You cannot honor God in speech and dishonor Him in secret actions. The sins listed in this chapter are still alive today. Hidden corruption, sexual immorality, abuse of power, injustice toward the vulnerable. Grace does not erase accountability. It increases responsibility. This chapter reminds us that obedience is not emotional, it is ethical. And every generation still stands, like Israel did, between Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, between blessing and curse. The sun stood high over the plains of Moab. Before Israel lay the Jordan River. Beyond it, the land they had waited for all their lives. Behind them was Egypt. Slavery, chains, whips, silence. And standing before them now was Moses, old, weathered, nearing the end of his journey. This would be one of his final messages. Israel was no longer a wandering crowd of former slaves. They were becoming a nation. But nations do not survive on miracles alone. They survive on obedience. So Moses spoke. He told them that the God who brought them out of Egypt was not only powerful. He was orderly, just, and deeply concerned with how his people lived. And then Moses laid out two paths. One path led upward. The other led downward. Blessing or curse. Moses declared that if Israel fully obeyed the voice of the Lord, if they listened carefully and walked in his ways, then blessing would pursue them. They would be blessed in the city and blessed in the field. Their wombs would be fruitful, their crops abundant, their livestock multiplied. Their kneading bowls would never be empty. Their storehouses would overflow. Enemies would rise against them, but fall before them. One direction coming in, 7 directions fleeing out. They would lend to many nations, and borrow from none. They would be the head, not the tail. Above, never beneath. Even the nations of the earth would look at Israel and fear, because the name of the Lord would be visibly upon them. This was not random favor. It was covenant reward. But then Moses' voice changed. The air grew heavier. He then warned them what would happen if they turned away, if they refused to listen, if they broke the covenant. The same blessings would reverse. They would be cursed in the city and cursed in the field. Their wombs would struggle. Their land would resist them. Their labor would produce little. Confusion would follow their plans. Frustration would haunt their work. Disease would cling to them. Drought would harden their skies. The heavens above would turn to bronze. The earth beneath to iron. Enemies they once ruled over would rule over them. Foreigners would rise higher and higher, while Israel sank lower and lower. Siege would come. Hunger would grow so severe that parents would turn against their own children. They would be scattered among the nations, from one end of the earth to the other. And even there, Moses said, they would find no rest. This was not cruelty. It was consequence. Then Moses reminded them that this covenant was not new. It began in Egypt. It was confirmed at Sinai. And now it was being sealed in Moab. This covenant was not only for those standing there that day. It was for generations yet unborn. For those who would hear of these words long after Moses was gone. And Moses made it clear. Israel's suffering would never be meaningless. Their prosperity would never be accidental. History itself would testify. The warning to future generations. Moses foresaw a time when strangers would look at the land of Israel and ask, "Why has the Lord done this to this land? Why this fierce anger?" And the answer would be simple. They abandoned the covenant. And today, here is the truth that still echoes. These blessings and curses were spoken to Israel. But the principle has never changed. Obedience brings alignment. Rebellion brings fracture. God does not change. Human nature does not change. Choices still carry weight. Actions still produce outcomes. Nations rise and fall. Families flourish or collapse. Lives prosper or unravel. Not by chance, but by obedience or disregard for truth. Moses ended knowing he would not cross the Jordan. But his words would. And they still do.
Did you enjoy the story? Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. This motivates us to create more Bible-inspired stories to share with you. God bless you.
Moses was born at a time when Israel lived in bondage in Egypt, crushed under forced labor and fear. Pharaoh, threatened by their growing numbers, ordered that every Hebrew boy be killed at birth. To save her child, Moses' mother hid him for 3 months, and when she could hide him no longer, she placed him in a basket among the reeds of the Nile. There, by God's quiet design, Pharaoh's own daughter found the child, took pity on him, and raised him as her son. Though he was born a slave, he grew up in the palace of a king. As a young man, Moses became aware of who he truly was. One day, seeing an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave, he intervened and killed the Egyptian. When the deed became known and Pharaoh sought his life, Moses fled Egypt and disappeared into the wilderness of Midian. There he lived as a shepherd, married Zipporah, and spent years in obscurity, far from courts and crowds, learning humility in the silence of the desert. It was there, in the wilderness, that God called him. From a burning bush that was not consumed, the Lord spoke, revealing his name and his purpose. Moses was chosen to return to Egypt and deliver Israel. Moses led the people out by night, through fear and uncertainty, until they stood trapped between Pharaoh's army and the Red Sea. At God's command, Moses stretched out his staff, and the sea parted. Israel crossed on dry ground, while their enemies were swallowed behind them. From that moment on, Moses stood as the mediator between God and a young, fragile nation. At Mount Sinai, Moses ascended into God's presence and received the covenant, the law that would shape Israel's life with God and with one another. Time and again, Moses taught, corrected, warned, and guided the people in God's ways. When they rebelled, complained, worshipped idols, or lost faith, Moses stood in the gap. He pleaded with God to spare them, even offering his own life rather than see them destroyed. Again and again, mercy followed his intercession. Yet the burden was heavy. Years of wandering, rebellion, and frustration wore on him. In one moment, provoked by anger and exhaustion, Moses struck the rock when God had commanded him only to speak. Because of this act, both Moses and Aaron were told they would not enter the promised land. The consequence was severe and deeply painful. The man who had led Israel out of slavery would not lead them into rest. Still, Moses did not abandon his calling. Until his final breath, he led, instructed, and warned Israel. He reminded them of God's faithfulness and cautioned them that once they entered the land, ate their fill, and prospered, they would again be tempted to forget the Lord and turn away. God himself told Moses of his coming death and of Israel's future unfaithfulness, but also of his enduring covenant. Before he died, Moses blessed the tribes of Israel one by one. Standing on Mount Nebo, he looked across the Jordan and saw the land he would never enter. There, the servant of the Lord died, and Israel mourned him deeply, for no prophet had ever known God face to face as Moses did. The mantle then passed to Joshua, Moses' faithful servant. God commissioned him to be strong and courageous, to lead Israel across the Jordan, conquer the land, and divide their inheritance among them. Moses' journey ends in Deuteronomy, marked by sorrow and faithfulness, while Joshua's begins, a new chapter of fulfillment recorded in the Book of Joshua. It is a story marked by calling, sacrifice, patience, and heartbreak, but also by obedience, mercy, and hope. Moses did not enter the land, but through him, a nation learned how to walk with God.